Hey class, we are up to part 3 in the Trojan War. We're reading about the wrath of Achilles today. Now, most of you were in class today and we read this aloud and dramatized it in class, but I'll go ahead and start the recording from here so that there aren't gaps for anyone who missed. Chapter 1 of part 3, The Quarrel, and we're picking up on page 75. Down from the peaks of Olympus swept Apollo in wrath, while the dreadful arrows of pestilence clanged in his quiver. Descending on the foothills of Ida, he sighted the Greek camp, and his silver bow hummed deeply as the arrows flew to their mark. First, the mules died, then the dogs. Later, the god aimed at men, and for 9 days funeral fires burned unceasingly. There was murmuring against Agamemnon because he made no move to appease the god's anger. But the truth was, the king suspected that he himself had been its cause. On the 10th day, Achilles summoned the folk to assembly because Agamemnon would not. This was the first time since the death of Palamedes that a lesser chief had dared send criers through the camp, so that fear and fury were in Agamemnon's heart. The place of assembly was buzzing like a hive of bees. For a long time, the voices of the criers could not silence the tumult, nor induce the excited people to sit still on the benches. When at last Achilles stood up holding the staff of the speaker, there was a sudden hush, for all were amazed at his boldness and eager to hear what he would say. Achilles immediately called up Calchas, the prophet, to tell the people the cause of the pestilence, but the old man was afraid to speak out. "Promise me protection if I tell you the truth," he demanded. "I fear lest I draw down the anger of one whom many kings obey." "No man shall offer you violence and live," Achilles reassured him. "Not even Agamemnon, if it is his anger you fear." A murmur ran through the ranks of the people at this open challenge, but the prophet, seeing that Agamemnon sat silent, was emboldened to speak out. "Apollo is angry on account of his servant, old Chryseis, the priest, who came lately with great gifts to ransom his daughter from King Agamemnon, whose captive she is. The king refused to let the girl go and insulted her father, in punishment for which Apollo smites us with pestilence. Only when we return the maiden Chryseis to her father will the sickness be cured." Countless accusing eyes were turned angrily on King Agamemnon, who, seeing that he had been put in the wrong, began to bluster as best he could. "False prophet and maker of trouble," he shouted at Calchas. "Who bribed you to lay the sorrows of the Greeks at my door? I will give up Chryseis willingly for the good of the people, though she is the prize of honor which the chieftains awarded me. However, I am your overlord, and I must have some prize for my dignity's sake. Let the chiefs make me ready another out of the spoils in the camp." "There's nothing to give you, greedy king," retorted Achilles, springing to his feet. "All the plunder in the camp is divided already. Wait until another city is taken, and you shall have some fair reward." "You forget your overlord," cried Agamemnon, scarlet. "Who gave you leave to call this assembly, protect your own ferrets and favorites, and demand my booty from me? If the chiefs refuse me if the chiefs refuse me a prize, I am their master and will take one, perhaps from Ajax or Odysseus, or even from you." "You dare not take from me fair Briseis, my prize of honor," cried Achilles, beside himself with fury at the suggestion. "I dare," shouted Agamemnon, "and I will." The hum that ran through the assembly died to silence as Achilles laid his hand to his sword and looked around for supporters. No other chieftain wished to quarrel with the most powerful of kings. The veins on Achilles' forehead swelled with rage, and his face grew red as fire. He had actually started to spring on his enemy when the goddess Athena, who suddenly stood behind him, caught him back by the golden hair. Men watched him struggle with his fury, but the goddess they did not see. "For years I have fought here in your quarrel," said Achilles at last, as he let fall his sword. "What harm did Troy ever do me? Fight without my aid for the future while I laugh to watch you lose." You will suffer fearful defeat for the loss of my valor, just as surely as this staff in my hand will never grow into a tree. Bitter repentance will not stave off the disaster that you've brought on yourself and the host." He dashed the staff furiously to the earth and sat down. Old Nestor arose to appeal to both chieftains for patience, but neither would listen. Agamemnon vowed he would seize fair Briseis. Achilles insisted he would fight no more for the king. As the assembly broke up in confusion, Agamemnon called for his guards. Achilles went down to the seashore and sat looking out over gray waters, calling to his mother, the goddess, who rose like a mist from the dim depths of the sea. "My son," said she, stroking him gently, "tell me of your sorrow." "Mother," he cried, "if my life is to be a short one, should I not have all that I want? You promised me measureless glory, in spite of which I am now put helplessly to shame. Since in a year or two I must die, the gods owe me my happiness now." "Bitter is your sorrow to me," answered Thetis. "Unlucky was the hour of your birth. Truly, since your life is so short, the gods should grant you what you desire. Let me go to Olympus and pray to Zeus give you victory to Let me go to Olympus and pray Zeus to give victory to the Trojans as long as you stay out of the battle. He loves me and will grant what I ask, never fear. You shall make your own terms with Agamemnon." "Terms?" cried Achilles in fury. "I'll laugh when he begs for them." "Listen for the thunder," said Thetis, "when Zeus nods his head to my prayer." The gray goddess vanished into air, but Achilles sat still by the shore. Tears came into his eyes for the loss of Briseis, since, after his fashion, he loved her. Yet the loss of her mainly hurt his pride. She was the first thing he desired that was ever denied him. Chapter 12. I'm going to pause just for a second and shut the door to the library because there's a lot of sound out there as my family just got home. Just a moment. Okay, now we'll continue with chapter 2, the combat. Down by the seashore, the people of Achilles were competing with javelin or discus. His horses stood quietly at their mangers, and his chariot lay in its shelter, well covered up. From the tents and the huts of the other kings, however, the forces of the Greeks were going out to battle. Once more, the gates of Troy swung wide. The plain was filled with men and horses and was ablaze with bronze. Earth thundered beneath the feet of the armies as they rushed into the fray. Paris, beautiful as Apollo, sprang out in front of the Trojans. A black panther skin was flung over his shoulders, and his curved bow was slung at his back. In each hand he brandished a bronze headed spear, and he called on the chieftains of Greece to meet him in combat. Paris was not often seen in the front of the battle, for which reason many of the princes were complaining that they fought in the cause of a coward. Spurred on by their insults, Paris now ran out in front of the army, intending to hurl both his spears and retreat safely into the ranks. With a great shout, warlike Menelaus leaped from his chariot as a lion leaps on a deer. But Paris knew him and started back in dismay, as though he had trodden on a snake. His ruddy cheeks lost their color, and he shrank back behind the shields of the spearmen. Menelaus cried furiously after him, while the other Greek chieftains laughed. "This war is fought on your account," cried Hector, turning to his brother, "and yet you're not ashamed to make us a mockery to the Greeks by your cowardice? I warn you that the Trojans will not endure you forever. Your beauty and your singing will not save you on the day when you lie in the dust." "Bear with me, brother," said Paris earnestly, for much as he feared Menelaus, he dreaded the ill will of the Trojans yet more. "Don't blame me because the gods gave me beauty while they bestowed prowess in the war upon you. Bid the Trojans sit down, and likewise the Greeks, while Menelaus and I fight our quarrel. The winner shall take Helen, while the losing side shall pay a great ransom. This will settle the struggle with honor, and the Greeks may go home." Hector made him no answer, but leaped out ahead of the Trojans, taking his spear by the middle in an attempt to halt their onrush. The front ranks stopped in confusion, whereupon the missiles of the Greeks slackened also. In a short time, both armies were silent to hear what Hector would say. Menelaus gladly accepted the offer of Paris, and the chiefs of each side bade their men sit down on the ground. A messenger hurried to the city to bring out old Priam so that he and Agamemnon might make solemn oaths on their people's behalf. Priam was sitting on the walls of the city amid the old men and the women. Even Helen had heard some strange thing was afoot and had come to look out over the plain. As she passed by the rows of the elders, they remembered the sons who had bled and died in her cause. They watched her, hating her in silence, until, as she walked, the wind fluttered back the veil from her face. They sighed as their dim eyes looked once more on the loveliest of women, and when she had gone by, they spoke softly amongst themselves. Small wonder, they said, that both Trojans and Greeks have suffered so long for her sake. While the champions were putting on their armor, the kings of either side prepared sacrifices. On behalf of his people, each swore to abide by the truce, calling upon Zeus to bring a vengeance if it were broken. Two men measured out a grassy space, in which Paris and Menelaus stood up to face each other. Paris, who was chosen by lot to throw first, lifted up his spear and hurled it with all his strength. The weapon struck Menelaus's shield on the center boss, where it was strongest, and rebounded on the grass. Menelaus, in turn, raised his arm. With a fearful crash, his spear burst clear through Paris's shield and thudded against his breastplate. Paris twisted to escape the full force of the blow, yet even so he went staggering backward. Menelaus bounded forward, snatching out his sword, and struck before his enemy could recover his balance. Paris ducked his head and received the blow on the crest of his helmet, on which Menelaus's sword broke in 3 pieces, leaving nothing but the hilt in its owner's grasp. Once more, Menelaus leaped wildly, this time with bare hands. He seized his half-stunned foe by the horsehair crest and pulled savagely. Paris fell forward, half strangled by the embroidered strap under his chin. With a shout, Menelaus began to drag him over the ground toward the Greeks. Paris clutched at the strap, gasping heavily. His face turned red, then purple, while his legs twisted in agony. Suddenly, the strap burst. A cloud descended upon Paris, and when it lifted, he was gone. The goddess Aphrodite had snatched up her favorite and borne him unseen into Troy. Menelaus tossed the helmet to his comrades and turned madly on the Trojans, suspecting they had concealed their champion to save themselves from defeat. "No matter where you hide him, the victory is ours!" cried Agamemnon. "Give us back Helen and pay ransom for your city, as you have agreed." The Trojans stood up in confusion as Menelaus came forward. Each thought that some other man had concealed Paris, but since he was still living, all were unwilling to admit their defeat and pay measureless ransom. There were many wild shouts of refusal, while Menelaus strode up and down, raging like a dog who's seeking the trail. "There stands Menelaus," thought Pandarus. "The war would be over if I dared strike one blow for our city." With that, he dodged behind the rows of the spearmen and aimed his bow. Menelaus's last hour would now have come, had not the treacherous arrow struck the buckle of the belt, which he wore above his corselet. Though 2 layers thus protected him, the arrow pierced them both and wounded him slightly. Both armies saw the blood flow. The Greeks raised a terrible shout and leaped into battle, calling upon Zeus to punish their enemies for breaking their oath. They fell upon the mass of the Trojans like an irresistible wave of the sea. Chapter 3, Hector and Andromache. The Greeks surged forward, shouting. Had it not been for Hector, the Trojans would have been chased in confusion to the very gates of Troy. Hector stood like a rock, and soon his men rallied around him, though their raging enemies pressed them hard. For a while the battle swayed back and forth until the furious strength of Diomedes put the Trojans before him to flight. At that, Helenus, a prince of the Trojans, who was their chief prophet, came over to Hector. "Brother," he cried, "we need more than valor to overcome a Greek who is favored by the gods. Go back to Troy and bid your mother lead the women into the temples with offerings. Their prayers will avail us more at this moment than your strength, great though it is. I foresee Zeus is ready to grant us the power to drive the Greeks back over the plain and set fire to their ships." "I will go," answered Hector. "But do you and Diphobus rally? Oh, sorry. Let me start that over again. "I will go," answered Hector. "But do you and Diphobus rally the Trojans until my return." There were great crowds at the gate as Hector entered, but farther in the streets were deserted, for the people were all on the walls. It was not the custom of Hecuba, however, to sit watching the battle, so that Hector turned his steps to the upper end of the town where the vast columns of Priam's palace glistened white in the sun. Although Hecuba was gray and withered by now, and the rims of her watery eyes were red from much sorrow, she never sat idle. Hector found her busy directing the work of the women in her house. At his request, she sent these out through the city to bid all women come to the temples with gifts. She herself went to her carved chest and took out a robe for Athena so thickly embroidered with silver and gold that it shone like a star. Hector turned away, leaving his mother to the detail of the processions. His melancholy mood was upon him and brought forebodings that made him seek his own house. It seemed to him that the gods would not grant him many more chances to see his wife. Andromache was out on the walls, said the servants, and Hector turned silently back through the streets to the gate. Long before he reached it, Andromache came racing to meet him with fluttering garments. Behind her, little boy's nurse was jogging along with the child in her arms. Hector gazed at the infant, smiling sadly, and said nothing. His wife, fresh from beholding the battle, could not control herself, but clung to his arm and appealed to him with tears in her eyes. "Hector," she implored, "stay at home for a little. Must you fight every day? Already my father and brothers have been killed, and my mother, whom Achilles set free, died of grief shortly after. Now you must be father and brothers to me, and all that I have. Take pity on me for a little, since without you I do not know how to live." "I do not forget you, Andromache," answered Hector, looking down at her gently. "Yet, if I shrank from the battle, I should be put to shame before all the women of Troy. I was born to be a warrior, and must fight as my nature bids me. Yet, dear wife, do not think I'm foolish enough not to know that Troy will be taken. My anguish is not for the Trojans when I think of that day, nor for my mother, nor Priam, nor my brothers, but for you. You must live out your life as a slave somewhere in Greece, and hear men mock at you because you once loved me. May I be buried deep, deep in the earth, where I cannot hear the sound of your crying." He turned from her to put out his arms for the baby. The boy, however, did not recognize his father and his helmet, and set up a cry. Andromache laughed through her tears as Hector put down his helmet, took up his son, and blessed him. "May you be a comfort to your mother," he said, "and a more fortunate warrior than I." He gave the boy back to his wife, who smiled tearfully on him and blamed himself bitterly for sharing with her the sad thoughts of his heart. "Remember," he said, "that no man can kill me before the hour of my death, which the fates fixed at the time I was born. Even though I played the coward, that date can never be altered. Go home now and sit down to your loom. Work is better than watching." He stooped to pick up his helmet and turned to the gate. Andromache led the way homeward, struggling vainly with her tears. The end of that chapter. See you next time.